Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week we come to what I think is the first, although I didn't keep track on this, but certainly it's the most significant occurrence, I think, in the Torah, in the narrative portion certainly, of stories that are told twice in the Torah and that are not exactly the same. B'lashon hamata, as an understatement. They're not exactly the same in the two places. Right? So we need to try to see how the Ramban is going to deal with that. Rashi is aware of it also, but the Ramban is really going to deal with how you merge the two stories. That's one thing I want to focus on. The second thing I want to focus on is the Ramban's general idea. It's not the Ramban's idea. Ein somchin al hanes, and how that plays out when HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes an interest in a story. So what does that mean? Ein somchin al hanes, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu cares. What about that? And finally, the third, I think it's a staggering pasuk. I think the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu, 40 years later, give or take, really 38 3/4 years later, knowing the tragedy of Chet HaMeraglim, still says, I thought it was a good idea. I think that speaks volumes to Moshe Rabbeinu, and I think it should speak volumes to our relationship with Moshe Rabbeinu. But so I want to focus really just on the first Ramban on the Parsha, which has any number of fantastic ideas. And we've touched on it before, but I don't think we've ever done it in depth. Says the Ramban, says the Torah, Shlach lecha nashim v'yaturu et eretz Canaan asher ani noten livnei Yisrael, ish echad lematei avotav tishlachu kol nasivahem. Okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, send meraglim, one from every shevet, vayishlach otam Moshe midbar paran, al pi Adonai kulam anashim rashei v'nei Yisrael hema. Right? He sent real people, real significant people. He sent the Nesiim, leaders of the Shvatim, and that's where the tragedy started. And we know how it ends. It ends with the Dor Yotzei Mitzrayim not going into Eretz Yisrael, rather their children going in. And that's what we have in this week's Parsha. Before we even get to anything, the parallel but slightly different story is told by Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Dvarim. And here Moshe says as follows. It's a different story because here Moshe shlach lecha anashim, fine, but here you have vatikruvun elai kulchem. The idea came from Am Yisrael. It came from you. Vatomru nish lecha anashim lefanenu v'yachbu lanu et haaretz v'yashivu otanu davar et haderech asher na'al lebah ve'eit ha'orim asher navo alehen. And then the most amazing pasuk, maybe in the whole Torah, says Moshe, vayitav be'einai hadavar. I thought it was a good idea. How could it be that Moshe Rabbeinu, 38 3/4 years later, knowing that this is the reason why Bnei Yisrael had to spend almost 40 years wandering in the Midbar, how could Moshe say, Vayitav be'einai hadavar? I got to tell you, I thought it was a good idea. But it wasn't a good idea. And I appreciate Moshe's sensitivity, and I certainly appreciate Moshe Rabbeinu's honesty. But Lemaisa, it wasn't a good idea. Okay? These are the issues we have to deal with. And as usual, the better we make it for Bnei Yisrael, then the harder the question becomes, and why were they punished so severely? Right? And the worse we make it for Bnei Yisrael, the more obvious the question is, how could they possibly have done this? Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The very beginning is Rashi, where everything starts in terms of the Meraglim. We're in Pasuk Bet of this week's Parsha, the first Ramban, Shlach lecha anashim, so he quotes the Rashi first. L'da'atcha. Right, so this classic Rashi, he doesn't even tell you, he's going to tell you in a minute, he doesn't tell you he's synthesizing two different sources. But he says, when God says Shlach lecha anashim, he didn't really mean it wholeheartedly. He says, Shlach lecha anashim l'da'atcha. Ani eini mitzaveh lecha. I'm not telling you to do it. Im tirtzeh shlach. Okay, Rashi kind of wants it both ways, right? If you really want spies, you could do it. Why? Lefi sheba'u Yisrael va'amru nishlecha anashim lefanenu. That's what Moshe tells us in Sefer Dvarim. Ki Moshe nemar v'tikvun alai kulchem u'Moshe nimlach b'shchina. Amar ani amarti lohem shehi tova. God said, I told him it's a good land. Shenemar e'ele etchem me'oni mitzrayim el eretz tova. Chayehem she'ani noten lahem makom litot b'dvar hameraglim leman lo yirshua. Right? Ki'ilu, God says, I told them it's a good land. If you don't trust me, fine, I'll let you send spies, but it's not my responsibility. Whatever happens, and God knows something bad is going to happen, whatever happens is not my problem going forward. So Rashi kind of wants it both ways, right? He knows from Sefer Dvarim that the impetus came from Bnei Yisrael. The question Rashi's trying to answer is, why didn't God say no? So Rashi, in his own way, says, no, God didn't want to say no. God didn't want to intervene. God didn't want to put his foot down and say, this is a bad idea. If you want to sin, which is a way of running the world, if you want to sin, okay, I'll give you the opportunity to sin, and then whatever happens, happens. Now, says the Ramban, V'yesh kan lishol. The Ramban says you can ask the following question. And I think of all the languages that the Ramban uses when he has a question, V'yesh kan lishol is, it's so obvious. Anybody, when I go to shul on Shabbos, says the Ramban, people ask me this question all the time. Im kain Moshe atzmo chata b'inyan. If the idea of sending meraglim is a really bad idea, then Moshe is responsible. Shenemar vayitav beinai hadavar. And even almost 40 years later, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, I still thought it was a good idea. V'lama amar lahem b'inyan haaretz hatova hi imra. Why did Moshe say to the meraglim, go see if it's a good land or a bad land? God already told him, it's a good land. It's going to be great. You don't have to worry about it. So why would Moshe send these meraglim? Va'od. Ma'asuha meraglim. So what's the sin? Ki Moshe amar lahem uri'item et ha'aretz mahi ve'etam hayoshev aleha chazaku harafeh hama'atu imrav. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu gave them a list of questions. These are the questions you should answer. Is it populous? Did they sit behind fortified walls? These are Moshe's questions. V'amar lahem be'arim hab'machanim b'mivtzarim. V'al kol panim hayu tzrichim lahashivo al ma shetzivoto. Right? What are the meraglim supposed to do? Moshe Rabbeinu gave them a list of specific questions. They had to answer them. Uma pisham uma chatatam kishamru lo efes ki az ha'am ha'arim b'tzurot gedolot. What's the sin? They told the truth. V'chi, as a killer line, says the Ramban. V'chi al menat she'a'idu lo sheker shalachotam. It's all a big game. Moshe Rabbeinu pretended to ask them questions, but he didn't really want them to answer those questions. The Ramban thinks that's inconceivable. Okay, skipping 2 lines. So the Ramban says, V'hinei, Moshe Rabbeinu omar livnehem kidvarim ha'eleh. V'hiflig lahem b'chozeh ka'am uv'mitzar areihem v'koach ha'anakim yeter ma'od mima shamru amraglim lavotam. It turns out that all the questions that Moshe asked, Moshe himself was concerned with, and he warned them, Ki d'chsiv Shema Yisrael, ata over hayom et hayarden lavo l'reshet goyim gidolim va'atzumim mimcha. Arim gidolot u'vitzurot b'ashmaim am gadol v'ram b'nei anakim asher ata yadat v'ata shamata mi yitzat mityatsev lifnei b'nei anak. If the people's sin was that they doubted God, lama yani et leiv b'neihem keheni hamraglim et leiv avotam. After 40 years, Moshe Rabbeinu gave them essentially the same speech. Listen, Bnei Yisrael, you're about to go into Eretz Yisrael. These people are stronger than you. They live in fortified homes. It's going to be really, really hard. So what's the lesson? Where's the sin? Okay, that's the first question. If there's a sin here, it looks like it's Moshe Rabbeinu's sin. Second question, says Ramban. Va'od. Ma ta'am leMoshe Rabbeinu b'shlichut hazot. Why would Moshe be in favor of this kind of mission to begin with? Im haaretz tova ve'ha'am rafeh harei tov. Okay, if it turns out they go in and the land is beautiful and the people are weak, that's fantastic. Ve'im ra'ah o she'ha'am chazak savruhu sheyachzerem leMitzrayim. Right? Is the idea Moshe Rabbeinu said, well, go see. If it turns out that it's going to be really, really hard for us to do, we'll just go back to Mitzrayim. That's not an option. So Ramban has very strong questions. What's the sin and what's the role of Moshe Rabbeinu? And how he answers as follows. Aval yishuv ha'inyan bazeh ki Yisrael amru kiderech kol haba'im lehilachem be'eretz nachriya. Bnei Yisrael said, listen, anybody who goes to conquer a new land, shesholchim lifnehem anashim, ladat hadrachim, umevo ha'arim. I need to know, am I going to attack from the east or the west? Ubishuvam, and then when the spies come back, yelchu hatarim berosh hatzava lahorot lifnehem hadrachim. Then the spies will go with the army. They know the way, they know the right plan of attack, and they'll lead them. Aharinu, we want to know how to conquer the city. Etc., etc. This is an accepted approach to warfare. And in fact, that's the approach that both Moshe and Yoshua took 40 years later. Right? That's what they wanted to know. We want to know how to attack Yericho. Which is the place we're going first? What's our plan of attack? Any responsible person would do this. Ultimately, 40 years later, when Yoshua comes to attack Yericho, he sends spies. If it was such a bad idea, how could he do it? Moshe was all in favor of it. You want to know what's the proper way to attack Yericho. You want to know what's the proper way to conquer Eretz Yisrael. That's what we do. We send spies. Ki hakatuv lo yismoch b'ma'asav al hanes. Says the Ramban, a very important rule. We need to do our part. Says the Ramban, of course God is leading us into Eretz Yisrael, and God promised us Eretz Yisrael. But Lemaisa, how you conquer Eretz Yisrael, what weapons we use, what plan of attack we use, from which area we approach, from which direction we approach, we have to do our part. We call that hishtadlos, or hishtadlut, our trying. And the way the Ramban sees it, and it comes up a number of times, we've talked about it sometimes already, right? We have to do our part. After we do our part, God will do his part. But we have to do something on our own. It starts back in Noach, when the Ramban says, wait, all these massive animals couldn't possibly have fit in a teva, the size that was built, even though it was massive. And he says, you're right, it was a miracle. So then he says, well, if it was a miracle, why didn't Noach just build a rowboat and God could have made a miracle for him? And he said, no, that's not how it works. God wants us to do our part, and then he completes the task, right? Why do we have this medrash? It's a beautiful medrash, and every child knows the medrash, that the Bnei Yisrael came to the sea, and Paro was chasing them, and God says, Ma titzak elai daber Bnei Yisrael v'yiso, and Nachshon ben Aminadav jumps in. Well, if you don't have to do anything, why didn't Nachshon say, I'm not jumping in? If God wants to split the sea, let God split the sea. The answer is no. For the Ramban, we have to do our part. And only when we do our part, and I'm leaving out all the politics now of the war we're in, only when we do our part will God do his. So says the Ramban, Ki akatuv lo yismoch b'chol ma'asav al hanes. That's not how God works. Aval yitzaveh b'nilchamim lehechaleitz u'lishamer v'larov. He commands the soldiers to make a plan and to create an ambush and to do all the planning they have to do, as we do eventually. Okay? And then God will come and help us. Okay? Those are the major questions. So the Ramban attacks it as follows. So he says, first of all, I'm skipping a few lines. V'yitachein, ki Moshe ba'avur sheyada ki hi shmeina v'tova ki Moshe ne'emar lo el eretz tova rechava. He just throws out a suggestion, says the Ramban. It's possible. Moshe Rabbeinu, who obviously trusted God, knew that Eretz Yisrael was beautiful and Eretz Yisrael was spacious and everything would work out. Ba'avur Cain, so therefore, since he knew the answers, Omar lahem sheyitnu leiv ladad Cain kidei sheagidu la'am v'yismechu. He's all excited. Moshe Rabbeinu, he knows it's beautiful. So he tells the people, yes, send meraglim. Go see if all this is true. Because when they come back, they're going to be thrilled. V'yachlifu koach la'alot sham b'simcha. The Jewish people will be thrilled and excited to go up there with great joy. V'lakach amar lahem v'hitchazaktem u'lakachtem mipri haaretz. Why does Moshe Rabbeinu want them to bring back fruit? Kidei sheyiru be'eineihem b'sheva haaretz. So that the Jews will see the fruit and they'll be excited to live there. Now he has another point, which is something he said elsewhere. Ki hayadua ki ein Mitzrayim rachok ma'od mechevron rak ma'alach shivat yamim. It's a 7-day donkey ride or walk from Mitzrayim to Eretz Yisrael. The Jews spent a minimum of 210 years in Mitzrayim. Says the Ramban, they knew about Eretz Yisrael. They're neighboring countries. I even think that the Ramban's statement that it's a 7-day journey is a bit of an exaggeration. They're literally neighbors, right? You walked in the Sinai desert, depending on who the Sinai belongs to, but it's Eretz Yisrael, and then you're in Egypt. It's the next place over. By the way, as an aside, it's also Egypt that surrounds Gaza. We surround it from one side, they surround it from the other. Okay, but that's politics, which we're not going into today. Okay? So he says it's true, so they knew it. So why would Moshe send them? So the answer is the same thing. He wanted them to be excited. And for every question that Moshe asked, he was excited because he knew the answer would be yes. So you could say to me, wait, so why did Moshe say, check the land, see if it's Eretz Tova or Lo? Well, you can't tell the spies, go and check. Is it a good land or is it a great land? That sounds like you're setting them up. So Moshe has to allow for the possibility that they're going to say no, even though Moshe knows that they're not going to say no, because he knows it's a beautiful land and he knows that people are going to enjoy it there. Okay? So that's one possibility. But then the Ramban says, nah, it's a possibility, but it's also possible they were in back-breaking hard labor in Mitzrayim, and they really didn't know about Eretz Yisrael. Right? You could be neighbors with somebody, but if you never go into their house, you don't see it. They were never in Eretz Yisrael, so they didn't know. Okay, fine. Now, let's go on. Says the Ramban. V'hanireh be'einai b'lashon ha'katuv. So what's pshat? He says as follows. Ki lo nimlach Moshe b'shchina. Moshe did not talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu about it. Now, obviously, we have to answer the question. Our parsha begins, V'yidaber Hashem Moshe lemor. Shelach lecha anashim. So what's going on? So he says, Ki lo nimlach Moshe b'shchina. Aval ta'am shlach lecha ki hiskimu lishloach meraglim. Bnei Yisrael wanted meraglim. So God wasn't going to oppose it. But how does that work? V'haya b'minhag sheyishlechu beis anashim meraglim cheresh lemor. Generally speaking, when you send meraglim of the type that Yoshua sent to Yericho. What are their names? We have no idea. We have all these spies in Tehran right now. Right? There's more Hebrew being spoken in the Makola. I don't know. We have them there. We don't know their names. I don't want to know their names. If you find out the name of a spy, that's a tragedy. We know the name of Eli Cohen because he was caught and killed in Syria. But otherwise, spies are anonymous. They're heroes of the Jewish people, but they're anonymous. Right? So that was the plan. Let's send 2 anonymous people who we don't know about. They're great athletes that can do a great job. They're going to mix in with the people. V'shiyishalchu mikzatam, we'll just send 2. V'Hashem hayodea atidot, but God, who knows, tzivahu sheyishlach ish echad mikol matot Yisrael. God hijacked the plan. Moshe said, I don't need to speak to God about this. The people came to me. They want spies. It makes sense to me. I'm going to do it. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who knows the future, didn't want that to happen. Why not? V'sheyihiyu hanisiim shebahem. God, who saw that something terrible was going to come out of this, he wanted to send nisiim. He didn't want to send nameless people. And that's the parsha, right? What are their names? Shamua ben Zakur, Matei Shimon, Shafat ben Chori, Matei Yudah, Kaleb ben Yefuneh. These are great people. Much more, says the Ramban, it's not really spies. It's more like a fact-finding mission. It's more like sending a bunch of senators. It's like sending Chuck Schumer or, Nancy Pelosi. They're not crawling through the bushes. They're wearing suits. They're coming to say hello to people. They're coming to see what the facts are on the ground. Ki chafetz Hashem shiyu shavim bi'inyan kol hagidolim ulai yizkeru v'yashuvu el Hashem. God thinks one of 2 things. If it's going to be a tragedy, let me send somebody from every shevet. So there's no finger pointing. Yes, it's a tragedy to have to stay in the midbar 40 years longer than you planned. But there was no sense of, oh, it's Shimon that did this. It's Reuven that did this. It's Yehuda that did it. No, it's Am Yisrael that did this. God saved us from what would have otherwise been inevitably finger pointing if two Meraglim went and they're from two Shvatim or they're from the same Shevet. Second of all, he thought, maybe if I send great people, Kulam Anashim Rashi Bnei Yisrael Hema, maybe if I send great people, they'll overcome what's going to happen. And they'll be brave and they'll be able to come back and tell Bnei Yisrael, yes, the answer to a lot of the questions is a difficult one. They live in fortified cities, they're very strong, etc., etc. But we could do it. Okay? V'zeh ta'am al pi Hashem. So that's why God got involved. Sheyihiyu b'mitzvat Hashem nisiim v'rashei b'nei Yisrael. He wanted the highest level of people to do it. Now, this is really fascinating because it didn't work out. Right? God, who knows everything, knows that the Meraglim are going to sin. So why didn't God just say, okay, I'm not letting them go. This is going to be a tragedy. If I just get Bnei Yisrael to Yericho, they'll all be fine. We're going to win the war. I know we're going to win the war because we're going to win the war miraculously. In the history of warfare, there wasn't a more miraculous victory than people walking around the walls of Yericho blowing shofrot and the walls falling down. Of course we're going to win. But God doesn't do that for some reason. And here I think we're coming up against the limits of something else the Ramban believes in deeply, which is Bechira Chafshit, free will. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course he wants to take Bnei Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. He really does. But he's not going to stop their free will. Even if it's l'ra'ah, even if their free will is going to lead to a tragedy, as is about to happen, God's willing to try. He's willing to try to impact events by sending more important people, by sending 12 people, by doing... But l'maisa, if Bnei Yisrael want to sin, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to let them sin. That's true for Bnei Yisrael. I think that's true for us individually, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu grants us the ability to make mistakes, and he doesn't really build some kind of net underneath us. If we fall hard, and bad things happen to us, and bad things happen to Bnei Yisrael. But that's how we learn. That's how we learn. It's a shita of parenting. I'm not saying it's right. It's right because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says it's right, but that's how the world's going to work. The risk-reward of schar va'onesh is real. If I do the right thing, God is going to reward me. If I do the wrong thing, God is going to punish me. He knows the future. He sees a person going out at night and he knows that something bad is going to happen. Maybe he tries to stop it in indirect ways. He tries to put facts on the ground that will make it more difficult. But l'maisa, if this person wants to sin, if Am Yisrael want to sin, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to stop them. Okay, so continues the Ramban. V'hanireh elai lefi pshat hakatuv. Ki lo hizkir Hashem leMoshe she'elatam shesha'alu lishloach hamraglim v'lo haskamat Moshe imahem. Why doesn't God mention, as comes up later on in Devarim, that the people want this and Moshe Rabbeinu thinks it's a good idea? She'ilu hayakain haya hakatuv misaper bekan vayikrevu b'nei Yisrael el Moshe vayomru nishlecha anashim lefanenu vayitav hadavar b'nei Moshe va'achar kach haya kotev vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lemo shlach lecha anashim kasher dibru elecha ish echad lashevet. Aval haya ha'inyan kach shesha'alu Yisrael hashlichut vayitav hadavar b'nei Moshe va'achar kach ba hadibur el Moshe kishar hadibrot va'amar lo stam shlach lecha anashim. God didn't relate to the fact. It was as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu had no idea that Bnei Yisrael asked this of Moshe Rabbeinu. Of course he had an idea. He knew it. But he ignored it. V'zeh ta'am vayatur et eretz Canaan asher ani noten livnei Yisrael ki hu midaber bi'inyan chadash lo supar bo klal. God is talking as if it's completely fresh, as if it's God's idea. V'haya kol zeh Ki Hashem chafetz leman sidko shetihiyeh hashlichut b'mitzvato v'shetihiyeh b'chol hashvatim uvigdolehem leman yinatzlu. Right? God is trying to hijack something that started as the impetus of Bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael say, we want to do this. And Moshe thinks it's a good idea. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes in our Parsha and says to Moshe, Kiviyachol, great idea. Let's send Meraglim to Eretz Yisrael. Right? That's God's way of trying to take a mistake and make it the Shlichut Hashem and make it his idea. But he's only willing to go so far. He recognizes what's likely to happen. Again, Bechira Chavshis and divine foreknowledge, how exactly do those two things interplay? Right? That's a big philosophic question. That's not something we're going to answer right now. But it seems like God is walking a fine line. On the one hand, Bnei Yisrael Bechira Chavshis, they want to send Meraglim, God's going to let them send Meraglim. And in the end, when the Meraglim come back with a wrong report, God is going to allow them to make the mistake and to cry at night, and then God's going to punish them. But he's going to try. Says the Ramban, he's going to try not to suspend the Bechira Chavshis of Klal Yisrael, but to sort of push it in one direction. Right? Lahavdil or not lahavdil. When parents try their hardest to get their children to make the right choice, but they don't demand it. They're not going to tell their children no. They're going to warn them, and they're going to reward them when they make the right choices, and they're going to do their best for their children to choose wisely. But in the end, it's their child's choice. It's their child's life. At different ages, obviously, you have more responsibility and less responsibility. But that's who it is. And says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm going to try to work it out. I'm going to hope that Bnei Yisrael choose wisely, but I'm not going to require it, and I'm going to allow it. And in the end, it's a disaster. And then it's a tragedy. In the end, we have to stay in the midbar for 40 years until a new generation arises, a new generation that's not going to make the same mistake, and they'll go into Eretz Yisrael. Okay? I didn't talk at all, and we didn't talk at all, about the possibility that maybe it would never have worked out, and maybe the Am Yotzei Mitzrayim, who spent all these years in slavery, weren't capable of acting on their own. And God had hoped that they would grow up and would be able to do it, but when it was clear that they couldn't, okay, that's the end of it. You have to stay in the midbar. It's hard, but that's the story. Okay, it's a fantastic Ramban that touches on big issues, including why Moshe Rabbeinu thought it was a good idea, why Moshe Rabbeinu thought if he gave them a list of questions, they'll come back with the right answers and be excited. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew better. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tried to change the path of the plan to be a fact-finding mission with Nisiim of Shvatim who could then be smart and be religious and convince the people otherwise. It didn't work. It didn't work. Okay, let's stop here. Yashkach to everybody. Shabbat Shalom, and see you all next week.